Hey Amazon selling enthusiast, it's Eric here. And if you're tired of the inventory management struggle, I've got a game changer for you. InventoryLab.com. Inventory Lab simplifies e-commerce, inventory management, integrates seamlessly with Amazon, and even syncs effortlessly with QuickBooks for hassle-free accounting. Go to Milwaukee Mafia/IL now because your success deserves efficient inventory management. Happy selling.
You're listening to Milwaukee Mafia, your podcast dose of Wisconsin Mafia and true crime history.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Milwaukee Mafia podcast. I'm Eric.
I'm Gavin.
And we are back again, Gavin. What are we talking about today?
We are talking, so this is the last days of Buster Balestrere and Joe Gurera.
All right. Have we heard, I'm pretty sure we've heard stories of Joe Gurera before, right?
We should have, but I did write a brief thing to help people catch up. I thought they'd like to know.
And Buster Balestrere is not related to Frank, if I remember
Not
correctly.
really, no.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm kind of, working my way through the timeline. And 1967, where we're at, is kind of sparse. Because Frank Balestrere is coming to the end of his tax trial at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Everything's kind of laying low. There's really no big events. He's all tied up with that, and other people aren't really doing things. So not any huge things. But I was going through and I thought, well, this is a good opportunity to kind of wrap up on Buster and Joey G. So that's what I'm gonna do.
When you say that there's nothing big happening, is it more or less like is the mafia just holding steady on what they're doing?
Yeah.
Or are they literally cutting back, trying not to do things until the trial is over?
I don't know if it's incredibly intentional. It's just Frank isn't very active on a day-to-day basis, especially because he's in Springfield a lot of the time. So he's not even in Milwaukee. I'm sure there's all kinds of other things going on. The bookies are still doing their bookie thing and all that. But yeah,
so it's probably
there's just nobody running the show.
Yeah, so it's more or less holding steady where it's at, and not really anybody there to say we're gonna push to this or anything like that.
Right. Okay, so to catch people up, Buster Balestrere, and I'm going to say that as Balestrere, and I'm going to say the Milwaukee as Balestrere, if you can hear the difference in my voice there, because they are spelt different, and so I'm going to try to differentiate there. Buster Balestrere and Joseph Gurera both grew up in Kansas City at a time when the Mafia had infiltrated local politics. Both came from families with Mafia roots. As adults, they married two Marchese sisters, making them something like brothers-in-law. They usually refer to themselves as brothers-in-law. Technically, I don't think that counts, because that's like if you're married to somebody's sister, not as if you're married to somebody and somebody else is married to your wife's sister. I wouldn't call that brothers-in-law, but they do.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a more technical term for it, but we get you.
Yeah. By the 1960s, they were often mentioned together and considered to be good enforcers for the mob in Kansas City. When Frank Balestrere took over Milwaukee around 1961, he soon had the pair, quote, imported to work for him to put fear in the local bookies and make sure that they pay up. Imported is the word that they seem to use a lot in the FBI reports. Buster was a distant cousin of the Balestrere family. The names are spelled different, but they come from the same town in Italy. But he's also related through marriage. His sister Mary was married to Peter Balestrere, Frank's brother, and his sister Catherine was married to John Picciaro, who was Frank's uncle.
Well, these Kansas City people really do have tight connections with Milwaukee.
Yeah.
Huh?
So it's a really tangled web here of how people are related. But yeah, there's multiple ways that you're related, either through blood or marriage.
So do you know, because this is in an era where these people are all going to have been in the U.S. for an extended period of time.
Right,
So,
yeah, these guys were all born. They're all Americans, yeah.
So, like, is, like, Frank's brother, you said, married one of the Kansas City people's sister or whatever, right?
Yes.
Do I got that right?
Correct.
So are they calling down to Kansas City and, like, hey, my brother needs a wife, and they're making that connection, or do we know how this happens?
It's a great question. It really is, because I don't think we have a way of knowing that, but I do think that there's a strong likelihood that if it wasn't arranged, it was at least suggested.
Okay.
So, I mean, I don't know that it's like, yeah, calling down, hey, my son or my brother needs a wife. I don't know if it's quite like that exactly. But because Frank and Peter's dad was also a big mob guy, I would suspect that he strongly encouraged his sons to marry into another family that with mob ties. Whether he, helped pick somebody out, I don't know.
But it's still the dynamic of there's plenty of people in Milwaukee that have mob ties.
Right.
What makes them extend out to Kansas City to find these people?
That's a great question. I don't know exactly.
Okay.
I really don't know. There's some overlap there in that Buster, when he was younger, like, lived in Milwaukee for a while. So, like, they know each other. But yeah, why you would purposely marry, I mean, for people not familiar, like, Milwaukee and Kansas City aren't exactly close.
No, not at all. And especially, I mean, they're much further apart, I would assume, in the 60s. Not that the distance is more, but traveling between the two is a lot harder than it would be, say, today.
I would think so.
I
would think so. I mean, I don't know what the highway system looked like, but my guess is there's not as great of options. So, yeah, I don't mean specifically, I couldn't say, but I would strongly suspect that there was some encouragement there. And yeah, why the Kansas City thing as opposed to other Milwaukee families or even Chicago families, I do not know exactly.
And that's a great point is that like Chicago is right there. So it would make a lot more sense to go reach out to Chicago than to Kansas City. But I wonder if that plays into the thing. Did some of the other mafias view the Chicago Mafia as, we're going to stay away from that because it's not a true, authentic mafia, maybe?
I think there's part of that.
Okay.
I do think you're onto something there as well. And, I suspect that because some of the Kansas City guys have the same roots, like they come from the same area, same towns in Sicily, that plays into it as well. Like, to us, that wouldn't mean anything, like, oh, your great-great-grandfather came from the same small town. But that meant something to these guys.
Yeah, and even if they didn't specifically come from that town, they still probably knew the grandparent or something that did come from that town.
So, yeah, I mean, I couldn't give you a 100% answer, but there's things. All right, so these two guys apparently did a good job as enforcers, but they were not well received in Milwaukee. Other mafia members were offended that they were passed over for the job by two outsiders. The sudden presence of two men with a violent history shown in Milwaukee also caused police and FBI pressure to increase dramatically. There was constant surveillance and questioning of the two and their primary contact in Milwaukee, who was Steve DeSalvo. They would claim to be in the asphalt business or dry cleaning, but never did any work. Finally, in January 1963, when Joe Gurera was linked to the disappearance of Kenosha jukebox distributor Tony Biernat, the heat was too much and the pair moved back to Kansas City around March of 1963.
So how long were they in Milwaukee?
Only about a year, a little over a year.
Okay.
Yeah. Joe Gurera would make occasional visits to Milwaukee after, and always brought the heat with him when he stopped in town. September 4th, 1963, he's back, or at least allegedly back. An FBI agent speaks with Frank Balestrere at Gallagher's, one of Balestrere's clubs, asking him if Joe Gurera was in town. Balestrere was annoyed at being asked, but he said, "Yeah, I guess I would probably know if he was here, but I don't think he's here." Balestrere said the FBI was wasting its time in investigating when they should be out looking into Irish politicians who let prostitution, narcotics, and other awful things happen in Milwaukee. When asked if he could provide specifics, Balestrere said he would not tell the FBI or law enforcement about any crime unless it was a matter of national security. He says, "If they were communists, I would tell you." Balestrere wanted to know what he did to get the FBI's attention, and they would not say, but they returned to the topic of Joe Gurera. When asked if Balestrere brought Gurera to Milwaukee, Balestrere claimed he did not even know Joe Gurera until he arrived in Milwaukee and was introduced to him by Buster Balestrere. He said Gurera moved to Milwaukee to put his kids in a new school. Gurera was unable to find a job or a house, so he moved back to Kansas City. I think part of that is true. I think it's definitely accurate that he knew Buster better than he knew Frank Gurera. I think that is accurate. He's probably overselling it a little bit here, though. Buster Balestrere is now, back in Kansas City. He's interviewed by the FBI at Peppino's Pizzeria on November 7th, 1963. He said he had been harassed by the police in Milwaukee, and things were published about him being involved in criminal activity that just were not true. Balestrere appeared to be bitter and used profane language when mentioning the Milwaukee police. Balestrere said he returned to Kansas City of his own volition and was not ordered to do so. He was now happily working for his brother James, who owned Peppino's. Balestrere said the interview from FBI agents could be seen as a continuation of the harassment that he received in Milwaukee, and if it continued, he may have to quit his job to avoid embarrassing his brother. When asked about Joe Gurera, Balestrere said that he was operating a pizzeria and a laundromat in Leavenworth, Kansas. Around April 1964, Joe Gurera suffered a heart attack. He survived. A few months later, he was reported to be very sick. He recovered. Quick side note here. In September 24th, 1964, a man named Charles Pearson is arrested for armed robbery. And he told the FBI about the murder of a teamster in the Kansas City area named Floyd Hayes. Floyd Hayes was shot outside a bowling alley in Kansas City, and according to Pearson, he identified the killers, 2 members of the Kansas City mob, and he said that one of the guns used was sent to them from Milwaukee by Buster Balestrere. The gun came from a Wisconsin sporting goods store theft. Now, I don't know enough about Kansas City generally, or this murder specifically, to really comment on it, how accurate any of that is. It's definitely true that this teamster Hayes was suspected of siphoning between $50,000 and $200,000 from Teamsters funds, and then after getting caught was starting to talk to authorities and kind of giving names and things like that.
And he was working with the Mafia.
He was working with the Mafia. He himself believed he was going to be killed, so much so that he installed a remote starter on his car to avoid being car bombed. So I have no doubt that the Mafia killed Hayes, but I have no idea, if these were the guys who did it. I'm not even going to say their names.
No.
If these were the guys who did it, or if Buster was, sent them the gun from Milwaukee. I have no idea.
What, would Buster have been in Milwaukee at this point in time? I mean, maybe he was just visiting there, but would he have been, living there?
He would not have been living there.
Okay.
Yeah, at the time this happened, he was already back. But it's possible that he went there, purchased a gun, or had it sent. I mean, it's not out of the question, but I don't know how reliable this guy's information is.
And the Teamster is for Kansas City Teamsters?
He's a Kansas City guy,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's just a side note. I can't really verify that. Buster was arrested in Kansas City on August 9th, 1965, on gambling charges stemming from a very old John Doe investigation in Kenosha. So, he's been out of Wisconsin for, over a year. And this comes down. He refused a waive extradition, and a hearing was set for September. He did not attend the hearing. In February 1966, when his brother-in-law, John Pachuro, died in Milwaukee, he declined to attend the funeral because he suspected that if he showed up in Milwaukee, he would probably be arrested. April 26, 1966, with an extradition warrant issued for his arrest, Buster surrendered voluntarily and went to Kenosha. At this point, he's like, you got the extradition, I'll just turn myself in. So he's now been formally charged in Kenosha and is awaiting trial there. May 1966, an FBI agent stopped at the Nothing Special bar, which is now where Buster works in Kansas City. Buster acknowledged that he had surrendered to a gambling charge in Kenosha. He felt that he could have fought extradition, but it wasn't worth the trouble because the charge was political and had no basis in reality. Asked to explain what he meant by this, Buster said the charge was for public consumption and nothing more, whatever that means.
Okay.
He said since he was 15 years old, law enforcement routinely harassed him and felt that he had knowledge on organized crime that he did not have. This was just one more time, and he had nothing to say to the people in Kenosha. Buster told the agent that he had no issues with being courteous and speaking with law enforcement, but he would not talk about other people. He said he was trying to distance himself from those in Kansas City that had a bad reputation. January 1967, the Kansas City FBI started to consider pursuing Buster as an informant. Over the past several months, as the agents would stop in, he would speak more freely with them and seemed to have built up a relationship. So they thought that he was starting to be vulnerable and, might let some things spill. I don't think this happens.
Okay. So your theory on this is that kind of the way your story is being told right now, it almost sounds like he's trying to clean up his life, maybe?
That's the impression. I would agree that's the direction he's headed, yes.
Okay.
May 1967, Buster finally gets, everything from his Kenosha gambling comes to a head. He's fined $500 plus an additional $287 in court costs by the judge in Kenosha when he pleaded to a reduced charge on his gambling. Newspapers called Buster the gambling kingpin of Racine and Kenosha, which is probably overstating it a bit. Whether Balestrere knew it or not, by pleading guilty, he now made himself ineligible for a liquor license, even in Missouri, making it harder to run a tavern or a restaurant. June 1967, an agent speaks to Buster Balestrere in Kansas City. Most of what they talked about doesn't matter for Milwaukee. But he did mention that Joe Gurera had recently had another heart attack. And a few months later, in December 1967, Joe Gurera dies. Virtually every Kansas City mobster attended. It's not clear to me if any Milwaukee guys were there because the Milwaukee newspapers didn't even report that he had died for like months later. This really went under the radar. Joe Gurera was only 42 years old. So I can say I'm doing better than Joe Gurera. I've outlived Joe Gurera, and I haven't had any heart attacks yet. So I'm doing better than he is. When the Milwaukee newspapers finally did run a story on his passing, they alleged that he had confessed to his role in the Beer Nat murder in his final days. He had made some deathbed confessions to authorities. One article also identified Joseph Garnieri, which I hope I'm saying right, as another Beer Nat killer, which I find unlikely, but whatever. For much, much, much more detail on the Beer Nat murder and Joey G., please check out my book, Shallow Grave, where I cover it extensively. But briefly here, I don't buy that story. The story that on his deathbed he confessed, I just don't see it.
Mm-hmm.
It's for people who don't know, like for the Shallow Grave book, I got the police files and the FBI files on the Tony Burnett kidnapping and murder. So I have, I got his autopsy. I got everything. There's no mention in there of any confession or anything like that. And I find it extremely unlikely that if he confessed, it wouldn't be in one of these reports. So my suspicion is this is something the FBI had planted in the newspaper with the idea of scaring other people involved.
Oh, into like running or something, so maybe it would trigger something to tell them who might have actually been responsible for the murder.
Yeah, like I'd mentioned this on a recent episode. There's this thing that they do, and the term they use is called tickling the wire. And tickling the wire is where they'll do something which just to see what the reaction is.
Mm-hmm.
And so if they post this story that he confessed on his deathbed, he can't say that's a lie because he's dead.
Mm-hmm.
So now everybody reading it, the other guys in Milwaukee who actually were involved in the murder
might take off.
Yeah, might take
run
off, or they might start talking to each other about it, about their concerns, and they might spill something.
That's a dirty little trick.
It's a dirty trick. That is my suspicion of what actually happened there. Now, I can't prove that, but because there's no confession on file anywhere, I don't believe that actually happened.
No, just remind me, because I read the Shallow Grave book, but in the book, do you feel
it is my favorite that I've ever done.
That's why I read it actually, because
Yeah.
you told me that. But
Yeah.
So I can't remember. Is there a lot of evidence to suggest these two had anything to do with the beer net murder, or is it?
Buster possibly. Joe Gurera was definitely involved in one way or another. Whether he was the actual killer, I don't know, but he knew something for sure. He was in there.
So because if I remember at the end of the book, you kind of suggest that you suggest another party that might have been responsible for this murder.
Yeah.
That is not Mafia at all.
Are
you firm believer?
No, I don't know about that. I wouldn't say not Mafia at all.
Oh, that's kind of what I took from it, was that it was just a guy that had a lot to benefit from the killing.
No.
Okay.
If we're talking about the same guy, no, he was definitely a mob guy.
Oh.
But, yeah, so, well, we can detour for a second here. Yeah, so, there's people that we know for a fact were threatening Biernet prior to his kidnapping.
Right.
And Joe Gurera is one of those guys. So
okay,
we know that he's somehow mixed up in this.
Was Joe Guerrero the one that went in with Steve DeSalvo to buy his place? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, that's what I thought when you had mentioned his name earlier.
Yes. So we know that he's mixed up in it somehow. Who the actual killers are, I don't know that we'll ever know. But then, yeah, the case that I make in the book is there's this old thing, like it's, I don't know if it's a police thing or if it's a detective story thing, but it's like who benefits.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good way of looking at, a crime, is who benefits from the crime.
Right.
And so I kind of look into the guy who took over the jukebox business, because the mob was trying to buy his jukebox business. They killed him. Then who took it over?
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of follow that. So yeah, I mean, not going to go into detail on that, but people can pick up the book, they can read it. But that guy's a mob guy. Like, he's not just some random guy. And I don't think that guy was the killer. Like, I don't think he was the one who pulled the trigger. But I think, like, he then became the front guy for the mob in the business.
Mm-hmm.
So
you think because of his death, the mob actually did take over his business, essentially?
Yes.
Okay. Man, I totally missed that. So.
All right. So jump ahead a few years. It's March 1971. An agent stops by the Wander Inn in Kansas City, which is now where Buster's at. Buster jumps around a little bit at different places. Buster said that he expected a visit because he was recently at Joseph Balestrere's funeral in Milwaukee. Here, Joseph is Frank's dad.
Okay.
He was at Joseph Balestrere's funeral in Milwaukee and said that police officers were writing down license plate numbers. So he's like, I figured they would know that I was there. He said he had been harassed by police since he was a teenager when he was caught selling a pint of whiskey to somebody. Buster said that his brother owned the Wander Inn and his wife was the license holder because he, Buster, could not get a license. He was still very involved because his wife knew nothing about ordering supplies. Buster was also upset that he had to curtain off the dance floor because bands were too expensive. He said because of law enforcement harassment, he could not get a job. The agent asked him, he says, well, couldn't you just go get a laboring job, something kind of anonymous? And Buster said that no, he couldn't because he had too many accidents. He said recently he was trying to help a kid fix up his car, and while he was doing that, the kid squirted something into the carburetor. This caused a fireball to flare up, and it burned Buster's face. He says, I'm not going to do anything where I'm going to get hurt like that anymore. He again expressed anger with law enforcement, and he said that he had served overseas during World War II as part of the 4th Infantry, and he had received an honorable discharge. He explained to the agent that he felt that this honorable discharge was just as good as getting a presidential pardon, and he shouldn't have his youthful mistakes held against him. Buster acknowledged knowing Milwaukee Phil Eldorizio for a long time, back to the days when Phil was young and was a boxer, and would still get updates from Phil as he moved through the prison system. Phil was in prison at this time. He said Kansas City was going downhill in the good old days were when Tom Pendergast was in charge and there was no robbery or rape in the city. He admired politician Adlai Stevenson, but he said the Kennedy family was awful, especially Bobby Kennedy.
So now they're interviewing him about his political views?
I think he's just rambling. I think he's just rambling here. But they just write down whatever he says. But yeah, it's so Tom Pendergast, the politician he was referring to, Tom Pendergast was the politician in Kansas City back when Kansas City was like notoriously corrupt.
Okay.
Like they had what's called machine politics, which is like if you wanted to have any sort of political office, you had to go through this organization. And Tom Pendergast sat on top of that. And he was tight with the mob guys back in those days. He had a guy who worked with him named John Lazia, and so his version, Buster's version of the good old days is back when the mafia you would get punched for voting for the wrong person.
Yeah, basically back when the mafia ran everything.
Yeah, back when they were running things, there wasn't any robbery or rape in Kansas City. that just didn't exist. Which I get that. I get, that's everybody does that. They're like, oh, everything was so much better when I was younger. Everybody does that. But he can't really believe there was no robbery or rape. It just didn't exist. A few months later, the FBI again meets with Buster at the Wander Inn. Buster had been drinking and said that he would chat, but he would not discuss anything about organized crime. He introduced his wife to the FBI agent and said that she was working more as a waitress these days because they couldn't afford to hire one. The customers they had were mostly elderly. Buster went on a rant about the government and how it fools the people into believing whatever it wants people to believe. He said he recently saw a statistic that called alcoholism the greatest social evil, but he said this was nonsense. It was manipulated because police would blame alcohol for bad driving when it wasn't actually alcohol, but people who were really on pills or dope. He said the government did many things undercover the people would not approve of, and suggested that the government should round up all the pimps and dope dealers and shoot them, and then tell the American people a fabricated story about what happened to them. He apologized to the agent and said that he knew this was strong language, but he explained that he had kids of his own, and he would personally kill anybody who tried to hook them on dope or pimp them out.
All right.
He's having a day. I don't know.
I mean, God, dude, when you listen to this, it's almost like when they come to talk to him, I feel like they're just messing with them.
Yeah.
Or he's like messing with them. He's like, what kind of crazy rant do I want to go on today with the FBI?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's that's when it gets fun to read the reports. It's like, what is going on here? And And of course, there's a grain of truth to this. Like, the government does do things that, they don't tell the people about, or they're a little bit...
Are you sure, Gavin?
Yeah.
I think they're very honest about everything they do.
I will defend the government more than most people will.
But they I
do think that the truth comes out eventually. I don't think anything stays hidden forever. But yes, we know
they have a little bit of a track record with doing less than honest things. Maybe.
Yeah. So he's not completely off base to suggest that they could round people up, shoot them, and then cover it up. I don't think they would. I think that would be a really tricky one to hide, but he's not completely off base there.
So a question for you is and maybe I missed it, maybe you did cover this, but he really never did anything once he returned to Kansas City, right?
In Kansas City, he's just a guy who operates a bar. Like, that's all he is.
And yet they come and visit him and question him. Like, I guess I can see maybe after he's been at the funeral, that's a legitimate thing. Because, I mean, that obviously still shows that he has ties to the mafia in Milwaukee. But other than that, like, leave the guy alone.
Well, they're trying to build a connection with him, seeing if he'll talk about things. And keep in mind here, these are Kansas City agents talking to him. So they're not necessarily concerned about Milwaukee.
Okay.
Like, they're asking, some of this I did not include, because they'll ask him about guys in Kansas City, and I don't include it because it's not relevant to this podcast. Mm-hmm. But they're not just asking him about Milwaukee when he hasn't been there in 6 months. So they're trying to get information out of him, and he is a chatty guy sometimes. Nice. So,
but it doesn't seem like he ever really gives them anything either.
Right.
I mean, other than some choice feelings about the government.
Yeah. The agent stopped back for the final time in April 1972, and Buster said his life was uneventful. He said he knew that Milwaukee Phil had recently died in prison, and that was all he had to say about that. By mid-1973, Buster had moved to Las Vegas, where he ran Antonio's Delicatessen in the Tropicana shopping center for his brother James, the same guy who owned the bar previously. By 1974, he was now working as a bartender for the MGM Grand. There was no indication that he was involved in any mafia activity in Vegas. He certainly could have been, but there was really no evidence of that. Buster died in April 1977 at the age of 58, which is also young. It's not 42 young, but still pretty young. His funeral was well attended by Kansas City mobsters as well as some men from Milwaukee. Most notably Peter Balestrere, being his brother-in-law. Based on conversations at the funeral, the FBI determined that Buster was very well respected in the Mafia, even though he hadn't been active for some time. Buster left behind his wife, a son, and 3 daughters. Although Buster often complained of being broke, his children apparently did very well for themselves. He has multiple doctors among his children and grandchildren. So.
Wow. Impressive.
Yeah, so... they did all right for themselves.
And I would imagine that means that he did all right for himself because somebody had to put him through medical school, right?
Yeah. I mean, they could have worked their way through it. I don't know. But I think he was probably doing better than he let on.
Yeah. So this is a crazy story just because this goes back to when we talked about, and I think we did this on the regular podcast feed when we talked about John Balestrere and how he kind of coined his book as Life Sentence because this followed him for the rest of his life. And Buster Balestrere seems to have been affected by the same exact thing.
Yes. And I mean, there's a slight difference. John did some things that he probably shouldn't have done, but
for the most part, he was just a lawyer.
Yeah. Buster, even though he was never really caught for a lot of things, they kind of knew
that he was up to things.
That especially in his younger days, they're fairly confident he's killed a guy or two, but he never went to prison for it. So him being hounded for the rest of his life it's fair because, but yes.
It depends on how you look at it, because, I mean, if they're just using him as a pawn to go find out more things about the Mafia, it's one thing if they're, like, trying to get him on one of the murders he committed, but it seems like once he got back from Milwaukee, it was pretty much done, right?
Yeah.
He never had anything else, and they just kept going to him for information.
Oh, yeah, totally.
And it's like, just leave the guy alone,
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's what the FBI does. They have a list of people who they check in with. Like, you'll notice, they weren't checking in with Joe Gurera.
Yeah, which, and that's another thing. Like, why is there so little of Joe Gurera's story in here?
Yeah, he got. I don't know. He got back. He started running a pizzeria in Kansas, and
they just kind of left him alone.
They just kind of left him alone. Like, I have the Joe Gurera FBI files. They're not. They just stopping in and ordering pizza from him. So I don't know if, like, they're just like, well, it's easier to stop at a bar in Kansas City than to drive out to Kansas. I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what the reasoning is.
That is really interesting. Yeah, that is super, super interesting. And you wonder, is it just because of the last name?
Maybe.
I mean, that seems stupid, but I mean, it's...
Yeah.
I'm
not sure. I don't know why that happened, but yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, so, like, nothing super exciting there, but I kind of wanted to tie a bow on there, and we can leave Buster and Joey G behind in case anybody was like, what happened to them? Well, they're done. We might never mention them again. Yeah.
All right. Well, do you have anything else for this episode?
No.
All right, then, as always, where can people reach out to you, Gavin?
They can go to MilwaukeeMafia.com, where I post the show notes and other things, or email MilwaukeeMafia@gmail.com. I can tell you the next 2 episodes. I already know what the next 2 are.
Okay.
One is going to be Frank Balestrere being convicted of his taxes.
Nice.
And the other one is going to be about a corrupt or allegedly corrupt police captain in Milwaukee who becomes a police chief in the Chicago area.
Oh, so we're gonna hear about some corruption. We like that.
Yeah.
So
he's an interesting guy, the police officer, man. He's an interesting guy. Yeah.
All right, and as always, we do have a Patreon, patreon.com/Milwaukee Mafia, or just go over to MilwaukeeMafia.com and check that out there.
Yes.
And we will be back next week with a Patreon episode and 2 weeks with a regular episode. We want to thank everybody for their continued support of the podcast. We'll see you on the next episode.
All right, thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to the Milwaukee Mafia podcast. Join us next time for another look back at Wisconsin Mafia and true crime history.